All right, Mel, if you want to go ahead and get us started this evening.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Dr. Melanie O'Brien. I'm the Vice President of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and I would like to welcome you all to tonight's webinar, well, tonight in Australian time. I'm going to start you off here because tonight's event is being hosted by my institution, the University of Western Australia, and in Australia, we always start events like this with an acknowledgement of country. And so I'm going to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we host tonight's event, the Whadjuk Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This webinar is hosted by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and we're a global interdisciplinary organisation with a goal of furthering research and teaching about the nature, causes and consequences of genocide, and we seek to advance policy studies on genocide prevention and accountability. Part of this remit is our current webinar series that we're running, focused on atrocity crimes and the environment. We've already had 2 webinars in the series, one focusing on Indigenous peoples and one on ecocide. Those webinars, if you missed them, are available on the IAG's YouTube channel. And tonight, I'm really delighted that the theme looks at intersections with gender. And gender is an area of my own research specialty, which is why I'm very excited about tonight's topic. Although I have to apologise to our speakers tonight that I can't actually stay for the webinar tonight because I'm speaking at a meeting on genocide prevention for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. But I am looking forward to watching the recording tomorrow. So, I'm not your chair for this evening for that reason. I'm going to hand you over to our chair, who is Emily Sample. Emily is the new media officer of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So she is the one who looks after all our social media and our website. So she's quite busy and has been organising these webinars. Now, Emily's also undertaking a PhD at George Mason University in environmental and climate justice, women's empowerment programming and mass atrocity risk assessment. And she's also the executive director of the Raphael Lemkin Genocide Prevention Program at the same university. So she keeps herself quite busy. And on that note, I'm going to say farewell and please enjoy the webinar tonight and hand you over to Emily Sample.
Thank you so much, Mel, for that kind introduction. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to have so many people joining on, and we have a great setup today for our panelists. I want to start off by welcoming you all to the final panel in our series, Environmental Degradation, Climate Change, and Mass Violence. And this is a series that we have put together in conjunction with the upcoming special issue of Genocide Studies and Prevention. And we are lucky enough to have Christian Goodhouse, who has been here co-hosting these panels with us, as well as Henry Theriault, who is the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. And we have hosted all of these panels in conjunction with the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, and this event is part of the Road to Geneva. We're very excited to be bringing together such diverse interests and organizations, and I hope that we'll be able to pull in a lot of the different discussions from these different organizations. So to get us started, I just want to introduce our speakers. Today we'll be starting with an introduction from Dr. Tobias Ida. He is a lecturer in politics and policy at Murdoch University in Perth. His research interests include climate security, resource conflict, environmental peacebuilding, and more recently, disaster politics. He has published in numerous journals, including Nature, Climate Change, and Journal of Peace Research, and consulted a wide range of decision makers. Tobias is a director of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. Oh, welcome, Thomas. And after his introduction, welcome Tobias. After his introduction, we will have 3 panelists who will be sharing their their speaking engagements. And the first will be Dr. Marisa Ensor. And she is a gender and youth specialist with background in the human dimensions of conflict, disasters, environmental change, displacement, and security. She's trained in environmental anthropology and human rights law. Dr. Ensor is currently based at Georgetown University's Peace and Justice Studies program. Her research considers the link between threats of peace and security and the politics of environmental management, forced displacement, peace building, and reconciliation, with a focus on gender and youth power dynamics. Dr. Ensor has lived and worked in 19 conflict-affected, fragile, and transitional countries of Africa, Europe, and the MENA region, and Latin America. Her research has resulted in numerous publications, including 5 books and 40 book chapters and journal articles. Next, we'll have Nyachangkuoth Rambang, and who is the U.S. Institute of Peace Youth Liaison for Uganda, Sudan, and South Sudan, and a 2019 USIP Youth Advisor Council member. She is the Gender and Social Justice Manager at Assistance Mission for Africa, where she conducts trainings and workshops empowering women to have a free, just, dignified, and self-actualized lives in South Sudan. She is the current Special Assistant to the AU Chairperson Advisor on Policy and Strategic Relations with the AUO and AU organs. Nyachangkuoth is a graduate of Bar El Ghazal University with a BSc in Economics and Social Sciences, specializing in the Department of Rural Development, and a Changemaker Bosch alumni. Nyachangkuoth aspires to get into a key decision-making position to inspire more women to reach their goals and dreams. She believes that if women are able to hold leadership positions, they can better serve their communities. And last but certainly not least, we have Úrsula Oswald Spring, who is a full-time researcher at the National University of Mexico Regional Multidisciplinary Research Center. She has studied medicine, psychology, philosophy, modern languages, anthropology, and ecology in Madagascar, Paris, Zurich, and Mexico, and has a PhD from the University of Zurich. She is the first MRF chair of social vulnerability at United National University Institute for Environment and Human Security, and a lead author of the IPCC, and was Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. Without further ado, I will hand you over to Tobias.
Thanks a lot, Emily, for the kind introduction and for putting this awesome panel with a lot of great speakers together. I was asked to give a very brief introduction to the topic and the field, so I didn't prepare a PowerPoint and tried to keep myself rather short. So when we see the title of the seminar, I cannot help myself to comment that this is indeed a highly relevant and timely topic to talk about environmental degradation, particularly climate change and mass violence, including various forms of political violence. And I think the relevance comes mostly from 2 areas. On the one hand, we see that climate change is increasingly affecting areas where political instability is either already in place or a real possibility for the near to medium future. And that is, to give just a few examples, is something like droughts in Syria, Pakistan, Somalia, or storms in Haiti, Philippines, or most recent example, Myanmar. So we basically see climate change and resource degradation happening in areas of political instability. At the same time, we know that in areas where we have political violence and mass violence going on, the massive destruction of both the environment and environment-related infrastructure, and this refers to, just to give a few examples, water infrastructure in Yemen that is systematically targeted during the civil war there, agriculture in Afghanistan, where water systems or fields are abandoned due to insecurity and migration or people fleeing from violence, but also transport infrastructure in Palestine, where farmers have difficulties accessing the field due to checkpoints and internal borders. And I mean, the whole field of climate and environmental security research working on this topic has, I mean, mostly emerged since the mid-2000s, building on earlier work by Thomas Homer Dixon and Hans-Günter Brauch and Thomas Bechler and some other people. And it developed rapidly in recent years as indicated by various publications, special issues, books, but also seminar series and the emergence of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, who's a co-sponsor today. And while this is such a relevant field that is emerging so quickly, it is also obvious to most observers that gender has hardly been considered so far in the wider field of climate security and environmental conflict research. And I'd say there is a gap. The gap starts to close, and there has been, I mean, this year and last year, 2 excellent reports one by various UN agencies on climate change, security and gender, and one very recent one by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. But the gap is still there, and it's pretty important to close it for a number of reasons. When we come from a political violence or mass violence perspective, we know that various forms of mass violence are closely tied to gender norms, but also to gender targeting, if you think about sexual violence and conflict or about violent masculinities. And on the other hand, gender intersects strongly with how environmental changes and climate change is perceived and experienced on the ground. And just to give 2 examples, this male out-migration as a response to declining harvests, but also female women having to walk longer distances to fetch water and forest, and hence having increasing workload. So basically, we have gender as this key cross-cutting concern among environmental degradation, climate change, and violence, which is so far under-researched and under-considered, but which is certainly crucial to understand the climate conflict link, simply because it is so central to both of these separate elements. And personally, I'm looking forward pretty much to hear the insights of our speakers on this interesting topic this evening, my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let's move over to Marisa Ensor, who has been writing a book with Dr. Ida, if I understand correctly. So go ahead and start with you.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Can I verify that you're hearing me correctly? All right, well, again, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you very much to Emily for that introduction, and to everyone who's been involved in putting together this panel presentation. I am thrilled to be in conversation with my fellow panelists and with all of you in the audience. And what I would like to do today is share some reflections on the linkage between climate change, forced displacement, and mass violence through a gender lens. Okay, and I'm going to use South Sudan as my primary case study. You know, it's a country that I have been in and out of for well over a decade, almost 15 years now. However, since we are privileged to have one of our fellow panelists joining us from South Sudan, I thought I would focus on setting the stage and providing the context for a conversation. And then my fellow panelists can jump in and provide more specific details about the current situation on the ground as it is happening right now. So if you give me a second so that I can share my screen. All right, are you seeing my screen? Thumbs up. All right, perfect. Okay. Okay, and I'm going to close this. There we go. And there we go. All right. Okay. Well, this is the premise of, this is the central message of my presentation, and it is also the premise that guides most of my current work. Examining gender differentiated vulnerabilities and resilience is critical to understanding and responding to the link between climate change, mass violence, and human mobility. Now, the links between these three factors are complex. Climate change has been found to cause displacement and to exacerbate the risk of conflict. In some cases, displacement is the intervening factor between adverse environmental conditions and mass violence, while in other cases, displacement is itself the consequence of climate-induced conflict. This kind of cycle between displacement and mass violence can be self-perpetuating. Climate change feeds into the nexus as a threat multiplier, intensifying competition for already scarce resources, including food, water, energy, and even habitable land. Displacement and conflict can be seen as opposing symptoms of the same condition, a lack of resilience and limited capacity to adapt. In the case of displacement, a lack of local options forces people to move out, which may trigger conflict in receiving communities. In the case of conflict, people who choose to stay may clash over increasingly scarce resources, which may prompt subsequent waves of displacement. The compounded impacts of climate change and conflict are resulting in displacement across the globe. But as you can see on this map, they are not uniformly distributed, again, as illustrated by this map. Okay. These compounded crises affect people differently depending on their position in society, a position which is shaped by intersecting variables that always include gender, usually in combination with other markers of difference, such as ethnicity, religious affiliation, generation, and class. While these interrelated crises can exacerbate gender gaps, they can also create opportunities for inclusive collaborative action. And that is indeed the main premise of environmental peace building. Now, this slide provides some background information on the situation of environmental fragility in South Sudan. We tend to hear about the ethno-political conflict, about the mass violence, about the violence against women, but not the environmental conditions in the country. And yet, according to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index, South Sudan is among the 5 most vulnerable countries in the world, with temperatures increasing 2.5 times faster than the global average. Environmental conditions are becoming increasingly arid, with intensified and prolonged periods of drought, punctuated by erratic and brief but torrential rains. These conditions promote both violence and displacement. And this is an example of what may happen. And this has been the situation since July 2020, and it continues to be that way. Notice the figures. This graphic illustrates the number of people affected by displacement. Okay, so this is displacement on top of the both internal displacement as well as cross-border displacement that had already been caused by the ongoing conflict. Okay, in spite of the revitalized peace agreement that was signed in 2018, well, the political violence may have significantly decreased, but communal violence has not. And in recent weeks, it has been on the rise. And well, there's a clear correlation between the areas more directly affected by the environmental shocks and displacement, as well as mass violence. So they are clearly interrelated and to a certain extent mutually constitutive. Okay, so these are additional recent images from South Sudan. People displaced in makeshift temporary camps. Most of the displaced are women and children. Food is scarce. And as I've already said, intercommunal violence and sexual and gender-based violence have increased. Okay. Women, even when displaced, and in some cases, especially when they are displaced, are becoming increasingly politically organized against violence. This is particularly the case at the community and grassroots level. Their voices are, however, not always being heard in high-level discussions. And this is problematic. Okay, so I know that I only have a couple of minutes left. So to conclude, human mobility represents opportunities that may aid adaptation to rapidly changing environmental and security conditions. Risk-informed, gender-sensitive strategies and policies have the potential to reduce vulnerability and enhance the ability of women and men and their communities to cope with, respond to, and acquire the necessary skills to deal with shocks and stressors, including those posed by mass violence and climate change. Thank you. And I look forward to perhaps expanding on any of these topics and answer questions during the Q&A. All right.
Thank you so much, Marisa. And building upon that, I want to hand it over to Nyachangkuoth Rambang Thai. And I believe she is with us. I think she got popped off, but hopefully she's made it back on.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Emily, and thanks everyone for putting this together and for also making this event possible today. I'm humbled to be one of the speakers or one of the panelists for this event. Unfortunately, I don't have good access to internet, so I ended up using my phone for now. So I will not be able to share my presentation or my PowerPoint presentation with everyone. Just not to waste much time, I think Professor Marisa, she has covered most of the parts, especially on South Sudan. And this is an area that I wanted to focus on, looking that I'm from South Sudan, born and raised also in South Sudan. And what I'm going to speak about generally, it's about the environmental climate change and also conflict, and also how it relates to gender in South Sudan. It's a high time also to talk about this topic because currently we have issues of floods that are affecting some of the areas in South Sudan. Talk of Jonglei State, Unity State, Western Equatoria, and also Greater Upper Nile State, whereby issues of floods have been on the rise since last year up to now, and there are a lot of displacement happening because of that. And when you see issues of climate change are really affecting communities, and it also contributes into intercommunal conflicts, because in most cases dealing with cattle keeping communities, when there are floods or there are droughts in the area, what happens is cattle keeping communities move from these areas to look for highland, to look for areas that are, less flooded. And in the process, that means that they're moving to other area for other people. And in most cases, cattle keepers, they move their cattle from flooded area to other areas. And in those areas, the cattle keepers who are moving the cattle are youth. And this is when issues of intercommunal conflict happen, issues of cattle raiding, issues of revenge killing, because they're trying to move to another area. And also when there is droughts, issues of, fighting over land, fighting over water happens because they're living from one area to another area. And this also is like a climate change issues, contributing into conflict between communities. Also looking at the intersection of issues of gender, I'll focus more on issues of women, peace and security, because when we talk about gender, of course, we're talking about the different type of genders, male or female, but I will focus more on issues of women because South Sudan is one of the countries whereby women are really, underrepresented in different decision-making processes. Women are going through harmful cultural practices because of their gender, and also they're being discriminated against. Talk of the stereotype and talk, sorry, of other issues. Some areas like Unity State where are oil production areas, there are issues of oil pollution. And when we talk about issues of oil pollution, you find that women are the most affected by pollution because they end up giving birth to deformed children, because of the pollution caused by the oil. But still, when when communities try to sit and address these issues, women are excluded in the process. So you find a group of people who didn't go through, how to give birth to a deformed child, how to go through, a complicated pregnancy, sitting and making decision on behalf of other people who actually went through that just because of their gender. And you see that issues of gender equality are on the rise because of such issues. When you talk about intercommunal conflict, you talk about all these issues, you find that women and girls are highly exposed to sexual gender-based violence. We have cases and documentations on South Sudan where issues of sexual gender-based violence became on the rise because of the conflict. But still, it's a taboo. Women are not supposed to talk about rape. Women are not supposed to come out and seek justice because there is a culture that says when a woman comes out and she starts talking about these issues, it is going to bring a big shame to the community. That girl will never get married. Bride price, is the one that is taking lead in that. And women and girls are being looked at as, source of income whereby cattle keeping communities rely on them to gain more cattle. And then also you see other issues of early forced girl child marriages, a 13-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl being forced to marry a 65-old man because of dowries, because of cows. And by the end of the day, you can be, like the community or the family can convince people saying that, there is a conflict, there is war, there is no way that we can keep these girls safe. So what we can do is, because we cannot afford to keep them safe, is to marry them off to someone who is wealthy, who can take them to a better secure place. So these are some of the things that are happening in South Sudan, especially in relation to environment, in relation to climate change, and also in relation to gender and women, peace and security. You also see issues of boundaries issues, is triggering a lot of issues and divisions in the states. Looking at the political arena of South Sudan since the conflict started in December 2013, the states has been divided several times. First, the states were divided to 32 states in a state of 10, and that caused a lot of issues of boundaries, a lot of issues of fighting over land and also fighting over borders. And later on, when the peace process was implemented and the RCs 2018 RCs has been put into work, we came back to 10 states. And some of the states felt like, okay, we cannot be put under certain states because before we were a different state. We cannot be governed by one state. We want our land. We want to have, a different system. And that has been also triggering a lot of intercommunal conflict between communities, because some of the communities also don't want to be like part of other states and so on. Also, looking at issues of environmental climate change, we see that there is a lot of flooding. Let me take an example of an area called Panyanjar in Southern Unity State. This is an area that has been, affected by the conflict since 2013. And it's like a closed area of a highland, but it's still this year it has been so flooded to the extent that there was no access to let's say humanitarian emergency assistance. So airports or airstrip had to be moved to a different place, and in that place women are forced to cross rivers in order for them to get access to food security, like things to do with food distribution, and also to get access to health system. Women have to cross rivers and Niles in order for them to get access to health system in the other places. And that puts also women in a critical position whereby pregnant women who are on labor pains don't get access to health system. They have to like cross rivers, and they have to, some give birth in the river, you know, and end up losing their children. Sometimes they have some critical conditions, but they have to cross the river to get access to, you know, to health system in Gangliel, and that's another different area. And because of the floods and because of the climate change and all these issues, these women are still suffering and are getting affected by this. Not to talk about also in Ural, where we had different conferences on women, peace and security, and serious issues came up on gender, that there are committees that are formed, local peace committees, and also there are different committees that are formed, but women are excluded in these committees. And for that, in one of the conferences, we had to make another conference, only we called it Women Conference. And in that conference, women started putting their demands in the table, talking about that we want to be included in the border committee. We want to be included in different committees, whether be it police committee, whether be it any other committee, because us as women, we have a fundamental role that we play, whether in conflict or in peace building, which is true because some of these women at some points, they compose songs to boost the moral, you know, for the cattle raiders, especially the youth. So you find that their songs give the youth moral support where they can go and also cattle raid and feel so proud about it. And we realize that they play a big role, you know, in contributing into intercommunal conflict. Also, they spoke about issues of when your child or when your son goes and cattle raid, when he comes home, you are the first person to know as a mother that my child brought something that does not belong to this house or it doesn't belong to him. And for that, they said we also can play a big role, especially in keeping peace between the communities. If your child bring a raided cattle into the house and you tell them to take it back where they got it from, they will definitely listen and respect us. But they said we are still being excluded in these processes while we play a big role, whether in conflict or in peace building, and we need to be included. And as a result, in 2018, in September in Ural, in that conference, we had a community within the community and all the paramount chiefs whereby women are included in all these committees, and up to now they are working and they are really playing, you know, a fundamental role in keeping peace between their communities. I hope I did not exceed my time, but this is from my side on things to do with conflict and things to do with intercommunal conflicts, things to do with intersection, gender issues, and also environmental conflict and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview, and you did not go over time. You were wonderful. So thank you so much. And I'd like to welcome Ursula Oswald Spring to join us for her presentation.
Many thanks, Emily, for this great organization. I'm coming from the other part of the world, and we have obviously these highly complex environmental issues. Central America and Mexico is located between two oceans warming up. Thus, we had last year all type of hurricanes, but we had also drought in the same time in other parts of the region. And beside the pandemic of COVID-19, obviously the other region with a very, very high impact of a non-traditional war, the so-called drug war. And this has different impacts on gender, different impacts of well-being, different impacts of vulnerability. So I think I proposed, I will just show 2-3 slides on one side in order to show, can you see it? This is how masculinity and femininity is globally managed, but also regionally differently approach. You have on one side roles, status, norms, and values coming out, responsibilities, needs, and expectation, but also sexuality and sexual behavior, which is very different. And this impacts on two crucial issues: division of labor and responsibility, and distribution of resource rewards. And obviously, when we put environmental issues together, this is Tabasco, which is still flooded from the, so I really feel very similar to South Sudan, because we had also big rivers 4 meters over the normal level. So climate change impacts not only as climate change, but as regionally different impacts. And then we have this global problem of enormous processes. So I want to focus on this dual vulnerability. We have on one side, can you see the PowerPoint? Yes?
Yes, yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Because suddenly something happens with my, let me find a way to get in. So this dual vulnerability, sorry, where we have on one side this scarcity and pollution of water, climate change variability, droughts and floods, loss of soil fertility, erosion and desertification, and loss of ecosystem services and biodiversity. Challenged by disasters, socio-environmental migration, and resource conflicts. On the other side, we have this pressure from the social vulnerability, where we had privatization of public services, overuse and polluted of water, hunger, malnutrition, overweight, junk food. Very important for the moment because of the pandemic, inequality, discrimination, inequity, poverty, misery, homelessness, and insecurity. And all these together brought us to violence, organized crime, ethnic and political conflicts, urbanization with slum development, disasters and lack of support, unsustainable modernization, and obviously a great social, gender, and ethnic discrimination, where we have economic crisis, misery, migration, but we have also social class, which is taken away, surplus created by society. And on the other side, we have this dual pressure on demographic population growth. And on the other side, we have the consumerism, the increase of greenhouse gases, resource depletion, pollution, and diseases. So all this is affecting what I call a huge insecurity, a human, a gender, and an environmental security. So it's this kind of synthesis. And obviously, the point is how to overcome ethnic, gender discrimination, where women contribute, not only in Mexico, but all over, to rural economy. And I just wanted to insist that women produce half of the food in orchards, in small plots of land, in only 4% of land, but could give half. What we have learned globally on food production is normally not what we eat. This is food production done for biofuel, for animal feed, so on. But women also care about children, manage households, give health service, promote hygienic fetch water and energy, and specifically today with the organized crime, they are searching about their lost beloved, because it's normally among women who are looking for their sons, for their daughters, who are disappeared by the organized crime. So Women only account globally 19% in parliament. And global crisis has obviously affected very differently men and women. And thus, our program of mitigation is very complex in order to deal with the process. So I'm happy to show you from Future Earth this transdisciplinary, multiscalar, inclusive approach on equality that gives a broad communication approach, and which precisely with the pandemic put planetary health together with gender issues, with risk identification, with monitoring, with strengthening climate resilient health system, and obviously with risk communication. I think this is one of the key issues in our countries, where people have a very, very low processes of this uh, uh, approach. So how to deal with all these complexities? On one moment, we need obviously structural peace with development processes. And I just wanted to tell you that last week, finally, we published the book from the International Peace Research Association Congress we had in Ahmedabad in India about decolonizing peace. I think it's an issue where we should link it to gender, link it to indigenous, link it to all our these processes, and where precisely justice, cultural peace is crucial with cultural diversity. On the other side, without sustainable peace and diversity of the great ecosystems worldwide we have in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, without any doubt, we have no chance to survive the coming threats. Then we need positive peace with freedom. We need agreements against negative peace in order to reinforce the physical security. But we need also equity, engendered peace, empowerment of women in order to find a huge culture of peace, a culture where we have human security. What is human security? Freedom from threat, freedom from necessities, cultural diversity, freedom from disasters, and finally, living in a world where we have greater justice and greater equality. And this is the last point I wanted to insist in our region, where really gender violence is dramatically increasing. We have about 10 feminicides per day in Mexico. Most of them are not brought to judgment, and therefore this impossibility of justice is increasing the violence, especially now with the economic crisis, with political crisis, with a global social crisis of the pandemic. So there is only one chance to get a future, a sustainable future for all of us together, where we can use this biodiversity, where we can reduce conflicts, violence, increase equity, equality, harmony with ourselves and with the others through this process of going by this point. And this obviously affects differently women, specifically when we have disasters. It could be flood, it could be drought. And I think drought is probably worse because it's the silent killer of people, where hunger is one of the key issues in order to manage this process. So in order to overcome all these threats we are living in and we are threatened by, in order to reduce the social vulnerability, the environmental vulnerability, in order to manage the coming risks, which are proper of the present system of destruction of Earth. We need this huge security globally, regionally, locally, and for all gender and indigenous people. Many thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Emily, for organizing this incredible panel.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I think it really touched on a lot of the important issues that we want to focus on. So I want to go ahead and open it up to the question and answer session. But I think it's probably easiest if people either type their questions in the message box or raise their hands so that I can see them. I will go ahead and start us off with a few questions just to get the conversation started. And the first, I think, is for the whole panel. I want to talk about something that all of you kind of touched on, which was this divide, which is kind of contrived, this divide between the rural and urban issues, right? We have women who are crossing rivers to get healthcare, or women who aren't able to access water, aren't able to buy food because they don't have space to grow food. So how can we address these issues in terms of supporting each other and building a more sustainable answer to these issues? Because rural and urban women, people of different genders, have different needs, but when we're talking about the women, peace and security, or the gender, peace and security agenda, we are focusing on those issues more broadly. So just to start off, if one of you or all of you would like to speak to some of your research on this conversation between women in rural areas and gendered issues in urban areas.
Can I go ahead? I think one of the ways to address these issues, especially issues of floods and issues of, having women crossing rivers and waters to get access to health system, one of the solutions is to have an early warning system in place. Places like South Sudan is not the first time for floods to happen. Floods have been happening for so many years, but there is no any system that is put in place. And also improving in existing infrastructure, plans that are already in place. And on top of that, also working on having a better healthcare system whereby women don't have to cross rivers to get access to health system, whereby they can just get it in the village or in the local area where they live. So I think lack of also enough healthcare systems also contributed into that. And also looking at how things are being considered, issues of maternal health are not being taken seriously, especially in South Sudan. So I think if people focus more, and if there is more funding and donors focus more on building a strong, health system, especially in the rural areas, not only in the cities, I think women in the villages and women in rural areas can have better access to health system. Thank you.
All right, well, I want to bring back the issue of displacement as both a consequence of mass violence and climate change, but also as a potential adaptive mechanism to changing environmental conditions, changing political conditions. And so rural to urban, rural to urban migration is a process that has been documented in a variety of contexts, not only in the context of the confluence between these two factors. And that I think that what's important here is to make sure that we have a clear understanding of the needs of the people on the ground, as well as their capacities to contribute to the process. And sometimes the divide between urban and rural areas is not as sharp as the way these issues are approached. And there's quite a lot of back and forth displacement, back and forth migration, as people find the context more or less amenable to their survival. So I think that I completely agree with the need to provide the right access to the right access to resources, but we need to be clear on what the right resources would be. And they may be different in urban areas because of the different kind of access, the different kind of resources that are available. But people themselves are not necessarily rural or urban. Their context depends on their mobility, and we know that human mobility has always been an adaptive mechanism, and it is increasing. According to the latest figures by UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, every year the number of displaced people has been increasing and is higher than it has ever been, now surpassing the number of displaced people after World War II. And so it's an increasingly important issue that requires focused attention, with the recognition that the needs are going to be different, and they need to be examining the context in which they take place without necessarily drawing a very sharp divide between what's rural, what's urban, and what's peri-urban. A lot of the research that I've carried out in African countries, the peri-urban region, which is frequently massive shanty towns in Kenya, for instance, I'm thinking, is a combination of both. And so this is definitely an issue that requires more focused attention.
Thank you so much. Tobias, did you want to contribute to that answer as well?
Yeah, just very briefly picking up, I think all the three presentations also touched upon the representation of women, or the lack of representation of women in both resource management and peace building issues, as an urgent issue to be addressed. And perhaps to add here another cross-cutting topic is also the urban and rural. So like the literature on peace building and gender and development are basically full of debates or of evidence that women, well-educated, English-speaking women in urban areas have far higher chance to be represented, to be hired by international NGOs, their voices to be heard, compared to, bless you, Marisa, compared to women in remote rural regions, where their voices are less heard. So I would say this whole urban-rural divide also adds another layer of complexity to the representation of female voices.
Thank you so much. There's a question in the chat from Fugera. Do you want me to read your question, or would you like to ask your question yourself? Not hearing her. I will ask her question. She said it would be fantastic to hear examples of initiatives that tackle peace building, climate change, and gender inequality at the same time. So maybe looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation methods with women's leadership. Nyachangkuoth, maybe this is somewhere that you can contribute some of the stuff you've been working on.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Initiatives that tackle peace building, climate change, and gender inequality at the same time.
Yes. When I've been working for Assistant Mission for Africa, we had a project that manages things to do with natural resource management. And we focused on issues to do with oil pollution, raising awareness on oil pollution, but making sure that issues of gender are included, especially the women, peace and security agenda is included in the process. So as we were working on how to come up with strategies on how to engage local communities into having ownership over their peace processes, we discovered that actually local communities know what affects them the most. So it is better that they are involved in any peace process that concerns them. So what we did in AMA is we worked as just facilitators to facilitate what they want, whether it is peace conferences. It is them who used to come with demands that we are lacking this, we want 1, 2, 3, and this is the role that we want you to play with, as AMA. And in the process, we looked at how this peace can be sustainable. So in order for that peace to be sustainable, local communities had to take ownership over the peace process by having local peace committees who do local peace monitoring, who took the initiative upon themselves to be communicating to other people in different areas. Like, for example, in the border, we have local peace committees in a place called Ural East in Lake States. When they see issues of cattle raiding rising and coming up, they're the ones who normally put early warning system in place. They go as far as making calls, or maybe someone takes a motorbike to go and warn people in the other side that we have a group of youth who are cattle raiders. They're coming to do 1, 2, 3, be warned and be vigilant. And in the other side, normally when youth know that there is a warning that already in place and the other communities are ready and they're waiting for them, normally such issues of cattle raiding don't happen. So we realized that to bring all these issues together, we need to work together with communities, especially local communities and different local authorities, from governors, from commissioners, and also from women leaders and from church leaders. Because looking at the cultural background for South Sudan, so many communities have a lot of respect for traditional healers, traditional leaders, and as well as church leaders. So we targeted this group also to be working with in order for the peace process itself to be sustainable within these communities. I hope I have answered you.
Ursula, would you like to add to that? Yeah.
I think precisely preventive adaptive behavior risk management is crucial. And there women normally were excluded because officially from the Red Cross, World Bank, through the national institution, it's normally an issue of men, but who are mostly affected also in terms of often in terms of losing lives are women. And I remember when I was at United Nations University on social vulnerability, we found that a lot of death occurred precisely because women were not trained in order to deal with the upcoming threats. So what we are trying to do now is linking in primary schools in Mexico to link up on one side how to negotiate conflict processes among children in the school, bullying and so on. And on the other side, teach preventive behavior, risk management, doing local mapping on this process. And obviously you asked before on the city context, on the urban impacts of climate change. As you have a high density of people, it's sometimes worse than in the rural area because people are massively affected. And thus we need in this preventive behavior taken into account not only the existing threats, but the upcoming threats. So linking, and there is again a gender issue. I have found out in all the social movements for the moment that women who take the guard, who say it's enough, organized crime, feminicides, violence, but also poverty, extreme poverty, which is not only in Africa, we have it also in Central America and Latin America. For instance, what's going on with the forced migration from Central America through Mexico now to United States? Now, this is an issue which is result of the dramatic hurricane seasons we had last year. And nobody is speaking about it because people lost their livelihood, their shelters. They have nothing to live, to survive. And besides, they had to take the organized crime in order to cross these very dangerous borders, which are all militarized, no? Which have this enormous problem of how to go through and how can we find a way. And it's again women who organized on the train, no? The bestia, which is the beast called, where people cross through Mexico in a very dangerous way, and who give food, who give water, who help these migrants in order to survive this very dangerous, but also they protect them, they tell them the ways how to avoid organized crime, how to avoid the processes. So all these kind of things coming together are done by women without any official support, just because of solidarity, because they know they are social vulnerable and they need to be supported.
All right. I just wanted to add that there exists a still rather limited but increasingly larger body of literature reporting on empirical case studies of projects on the ground that have tackled the nexus gender, climate, security writ large, and that the literature is limited because the number of case studies are limited as well. We still seem to be plagued both in academia and in the community of practice by this silo approach, and it is more common to tackle gender and conflict separately or gender and environment separately and not all three issues together, but some examples already are available. One, Tobias mentioned it already at the beginning, is this report by the Georgetown Institute on Women, Peace and Security on the nexus between these three issues. There's another slightly earlier one by the UN. It's a collaborative project between UN Women, UNEP, UNDP, the Environment and Development, and the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, I believe it is. And it's a collection of empirical case studies. I contribute a chapter on Egypt, and all of the other chapters are also reporting on specific case studies that tackle this nexus. And so, for those who are interested in the literature, is limited, but it exists and it is slowly growing. So we're getting there.
Thank you, Marisa. And I second the call for anyone who's interested in writing these case studies, please write them. We need to break down those silos. And as a just brief note, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about the reason for this panel is that because we are working on a special issue of genocide prevention, genocide studies and prevention, specifically on this nexus. So if you have, if you are doing a case study, if you're writing about this, this is exactly what we want to be talking about. So I want to welcome Sag Shah to ask your question.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask a question with, of course, with regards to this gender violence issue. When I've been doing the research from the area I've looked at in India, where there is a lot of gender violence because the girls and the women and possibly the men as well, they're taken through slavery or child sex slavery because they're taken into mining minerals for products. And my question is that people are talking about climate change and gender diversity and equality. The area that I've looked at is that the products that they are mining are minerals for green renewables, for wind turbines and solar panels. And people are saying divest from coal, divest from coal. I've seen research that shows that for all three components of wind turbines, you need tons of coal. But my question here is focused on the fact that how can we solve climate change? How can we solve gender abuse of women and possibly men as well, when the products that me is demanding in the West are conflated in the very problems that we are meant to try and stop? And just one other thing is that someone mentioned the UN earlier at the beginning of the conversation or throughout. I should like to note that between 2000 and 2019, the UN peacekeepers have both been noted twice on 2 occasions of sexual violence against people in 2 countries. And how can we again be supporting the United Nations for climate change when they themselves, their peacekeepers, are responsible and have not been indicted for sexual violence? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. That is an important issue. Is not only this issue, but we can speak a little bit more broadly, if the presenters wish to, on some of the implications of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and how they can have some negative effects if they are not implemented with do no harm lens.
Okay, I can just briefly tackle one portion of that question. I can't speak to the situation in India because unfortunately that's not a part of the world where I've conducted any research, but I can say a few words about the comment regarding peacekeeping. And I think it's important to have an understanding of how peacekeeping operations actually work. I'm not sure if you're aware that the UN doesn't actually have any peacekeeping army themselves. Peacekeepers always come from other countries, and it's to their superiors in those countries that they are responsible. And so when these kind of activities that you were referring to, potential sexual abuse, takes place, it is carried out by soldiers that belong to the armies of the countries that provide those soldiers. And it's only their superiors that have the capacity to bring them to justice. The UN doesn't have the capability to impose justice. They respond to their superiors in their country. And so I think it's slightly misleading to approach the issue the way it has been phrased. It is indeed a very serious problem. It is probably happening more often than it has been reported, but in order to tackle it, we need to understand how it is happening and what are the available venues that we have to address it. And if we keep in mind that it is not the UN that has the responsibility to discipline those who engage in that kind of behavior because of the way it is structured, it is the countries who are providing their soldiers and the kind of soldiers they are provided whose responsibility it is. So definitely a very important issue and one that requires collaboration between all of the parties involved so that it doesn't happen. But that is the way it would happen, by making their superiors, the higher ranking officers of the countries providing the blue helmets, who are responsible in this situation.
You raised a more global problem: military, gender violence, and obviously war. And there we go back to the origin of violence. I think, and I was always, when we speak about peace building, so surprised that all these very famous male peace specialists who have developed negative, positive, and so on pieces all of them forgot that patriarchy is the origin of this violence, and it has to do with elimination, destruction of women. It has precisely the origin of how discrimination, how exploitation, how violence was based in origin of our culture. And for this reason, I'm insisting that we need a different peace approach, an engendered peace, where obviously sustainability is now crucial in order to have peace with nature and peace with ourselves. And this means that through the military process, and you can see it worldwide, you can see it in Japan, you can see it in United States, but also you can see it now in my country, where with the National Guards, the government is trying to reduce the organized crime. Obviously, there is an enormous problem where the military are coming, rape and gender violence is increasing, and women are starting to get organized against all this kind of military management of violence and finding new ways in order to preventively avoid these kind of processes. And there is Betty Reeden, I think, with her book on the war as an origin of the whole patriarchy is obviously crucial for this thing. Thank you.
Just to add on what the two panelists said on that, I'm not sure about the cultural background for India, but I'll speak from the perspective of South Sudan, whereby the harmful cultural practices, the norms, the stereotype, all contributes to issues of not addressing issues of sexual gender-based violence. For example, in the way of seeking justice, 2 weeks ago, I was in Wow, and Wow happened to be one of the states that have the only female governor in this new government of transitional justice for South Sudan, the new government of unity in South Sudan. So she raised that some of the issues that are affecting issues of security and also that are tying her hand into implementing, peace and justice, especially to women and girls, is when an issue of sexual gender-based violence happens, people take it to court to seek justice. And in the final stages, whereby the case is already in the court, you find families of the survivor coming to pull the case, and they tell the judge, or they tell the people who are in charge of the case that we are going to sort this one at home. So sorting it at the house level means a compensation that is going to be paid by the perpetrator. He's not going to be held accountable, and justice is not going to take place. And that compensation is going to the family, not going to the victim. And this is when issues of exploitations happen, because we have cultures and we have norms that still exploit young girls. They are the survivors. They're the ones who went through the violation. They're the ones who went through the trauma, but a compensation is being paid to their families, to the people who are, who are by culture in charge of them, their brothers, their uncles, according to the law. And that's it, without looking at the impact that it has created on that young child. And tomorrow you find the same survivor is being married, find that the same child is being married off to the perpetrator, saying that they're trying to cover the shame. So you can imagine the amount of the trauma that the survivor is going to go through living with a perpetrator that violated her against her will in the same house, and in future being the mother to his children. So these are the things that happen because of the harmful cultural practices that we have in South Sudan. And I would say that it is something that the international community can't do anything about it. That change, it has to come within, it has to come from us, South Sudanese, to be willing to fight this, and also to be willing, to seek justice for survivors, and also to be willing to take cases further to other, stages. Other than that, there is nothing that the international community can do. There is nothing that the UN can do to save us. It has to come from us, from within. And for that, it will take a lot of awareness raising. It will take a lot of lobby and policy advocacy in order for us to bring, different stakeholders to come and address these issues and make, concrete decisions that are against issues of exploitation and also issues of harmful cultural practices towards survivors and towards women and girls in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't want to get too deep down this specific rabbit hole, but there is good conversation happening in the chat here, kind of reporting about different directions that the UN can take some action on its peacekeepers, and a few links for people who are interested in following up on this topic. I see a hand from Cipriano. If you'd like to unmute and ask your question. No, you were unmuted for a second. You're still on mute. There we go.
Okay, good evening. Do you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, actually I'm from Timor-Leste. Okay, here is my question. We know that right now, even in our country, Timor-Leste, still happening about the gender equality. Where right now we are as a young that are still fighting for this kind of action or these issues. So as like we know about the gender equality, like still happening around the corner of the world. So what do you think about it as a big organization, which is like everybody knows it? And what do you think, and what kind of the way that you guys are going to handle this kind of action? That it's like really like many people doesn't care about the gender equality, and but we know that there is a rule, there is a law for it, but many people are still like doesn't care about it. So how do you think about it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think it has to do a lot with positive reinforcements. And there is the first issue, which is gender quota. I think in a country, from the local level to the national level, but also at international level, if we could really grant in the parliament equality of men and women, the interests are so different when women and men are doing laws, and this helps. On the other side, positive reinforcement by the government, but also by society, in order to give the same salary, force enterprises, force people to pay the same amount of money for men and women for the same work. This is the second crucial. The third is visibilizing the unpaid homework and care work that women are doing globally, which should be just as part of the GDP, non-paid GDP, which is normally reinforcing the richness of a country. So, and fourth, we women with sorority, not fraternity, sorority, we really should reinforce us, each of us. For instance, first, I'm forcing my students, men and women, to bring in each of their theses, not only male discussion done and male books, but also some approaches from the female, from the women approach. And suddenly they see, for instance, I teach in the engineering school of sustainable energy. And the groups we form together to work in research should also always be mixed. And this gave this male engineer a very different approach working together with female engineers. So from this bottom-up and top-down process, I think we can start to overcome this crucial and long-term, 5,000 years or more of gender discrimination. It's not a thing of one day, but it's a process. And if I look from my grandmother to my daughter, I know there was a big change in this process, and we have to go through this way in order to change the things on Earth.
Thank you so much, Ursula. Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this?
All right, well, I'm not sure that I would be comfortable suggesting an overarching strategy to address gender issues across the world. But from my own experience, it tends, attempts to suggest that ideological components of culture need to be changed, especially when it's a project that is brought from abroad, tends not to be particularly helpful for some of the reasons that Nyachangkuoth already listed. I think that current efforts to address violence against women in context of war and violent conflict are doomed to fail because of our insistence on narrowly focusing on the situation during violent conflict. And we need to realize, as both Ursula and Nyachangkuoth already mentioned, that violence against women, the marginalization that women endure, is often part of the cultural background of their own societies. And that happens during times of war and during times of so-called normalcy. And that quite often, most of that violence is perpetuated within their households, perpetuated by their own family members. And so trying to suppress that violence only in the context of war and only when it is perpetrated by the enemy is doomed to fail. Okay? I find that by focusing on the practical implications of addressing this inequality, by showing evidence, and research shows incontrovertibly that when women participate in peace agreements, for instance, the likelihood that the peace process will be more successful and more sustainable increases by a certain percentage that has already been calculated. We have plenty of empirical evidence suggesting that when women are educated, the health of their children increases, that development indicators increase when women are given access to certain resources. Okay? So I tend to find that because these realities are more easily demonstrable, it's an easier entry point for applied projects than simply awareness-raising campaigns where people are told you're violating the human rights of your women and that your culture is problematic because that's the way you're treating members of that particular ethnic group. That would be perhaps a second step, but I personally find that a more practical entry point showing the evidence, the tangible benefits of doing that tends to be more effective.
Thank you.
If I may also add, and it's perhaps a point to make a bit late, 4 minutes towards the end of the panel. But I think it's also pretty crucial, both from an analytical but also from a practical perspective, to not 100% equal gender climate change and violence with women climate change and violence. I think there is a difference, and for instance, one issue we haven't talked about at all is sexual minorities, so those that escape the typical male-female binary, which are often highly vulnerable both to sexualized violence and to disasters, which there's even less research than on women, climate change and conflict. And then there's also sort of overarching, there's also overarching cultures of violence, which in certain contexts also define male roles in certain ways as the good warriors who steal the cattle or defend the fatherland or are battle hardened and thus good husbands, where there's a role of both men and women in reproducing these gendered stereotypes and roles and identities that in turn perpetuate violence. And I think these are two issues that I would say are also pretty important to include in this whole agenda on climate, gender, and conflict, which is totally not to discount all of what has been said about the role of women and their double burdens and their exposure to violence. It's just saying there's even more to this topic to be considered.
I fully agree with Tobias. And I think we need both. And for instance, in my institute, we are working not only on a new femininity in order to overcome this cultural, structural system of repression, but also a new masculinity. And this is very interesting to look. We women, I think we have moved worldwide faster than men. So how now to do this relational process between men and women, and this known also with all type of other sexual minorities, no? So in order to reinforce the relationship between both, and in order to find a new non-violent way, and this must be an engendered peace process. If not, we can't get through the structural patriarchal violence we have behind.
Thank you so much. And I want to just let Nyachangkuoth jump in here and maybe conclude our discussion with her response to this question.
For me, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it takes a lot of working with the community. For example, when I was working with AMA, we were implementing a lot of trainings on awareness, raising, on lobby and advocacy, on women's rights and issues of women, peace and security. And then these women came up and they told us, for us, we are hungry, we need food, we don't need trainings. And this is when we had to re-strategize and see how to, bring the livelihood aspect into the project. And we shaped the project. And as I'm talking to you right now, we have women who are economically independent and are able to feed their families. And this is where it's important to work with local communities to address real issues that are affecting them. Talking on issues of how women and girls, have been, robbed out of their basic human rights. I would say, as a South Sudanese woman, I'm in a place where my mother, was never in that place before. My grandmother never went to school the same as my mother, but she made sure that we get a proper education, and we aim even to do masters and PhD. And for me, I think this is a big and a huge change. However much people are trying to look at the negative side that, women are still discriminated against, the amount of stereotype is too much. But I could say, like, 2 generations later, there is a big change that is being witnessed. If it was to be my mother today, she could have been in the kitchen, but I'm here joining this event, and I'm able to speak about real issues that are affecting, women, affecting communities. And for me, I think that is a positive thing that to carry forward. Women, are making differences, especially in South Sudan. Women are coming up, women are talking about these issues. And recently on social media, we had this hashtag South Sudanese survivor. And these are women who are survivors of sexual gender-based violence, who have been afraid of the stereotype and the stigma, and they kept quiet for so long, but they came out and they started talking about horrible stories, how they got raped, how they were sexually assaulted by relatives who are related to them, and perpetrators were living with them in the same house. And nobody believed that, because perpetrators took that for granted, that, because of the culture that we have, we will never get caught. Justice will never prevail. But women broke that stigma and that stereotype, and they came out and they started speaking. And that tells you that there is a lot of difference, from long time ago, and things are changing. Change is happening, and things are taking place. And also on this gender aspect, yes, maybe the panelists or maybe myself, I have taken a big part focusing on women. And I mentioned earlier why, because when we talk about issues of gender equality in South Sudan, we talk about decades of oppression, decades of women being oppressed and not coming up and speaking about issues. So when we start about issues of equality, we are talking about one gender that has been privileged and that has taken the privileges for granted and to the next level. And we're talking about another gender that has been down for so long. And for that, always issues of inequality comes. But still, we say that we need male champions to be championing this, this change. We need male champions to be included in this process, because we cannot work as women excluding men, because we have to include them in the whole process. And for that, we have some men also that we call the gatekeepers in some of the projects we are implementing, and they're also working together with us to address these issues, because communities also listen to more male, guys, because of their culture and because of the norms. If it comes from a man, it is valid, but if it comes from a woman alone, nobody will take it serious. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That an absolutely fantastic question to wrap up on, that just really brought together so many of the issues that we talked about today, from patriarchal violence to non-binary genders to the long-term oppression of women. This has just been a fantastic discussion. And I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us, both staying up late and getting up very early across the spectrum here. But this has been such a rich discussion, and I'm so thankful for all of your participation. And thank you so much to all of the participants for this fantastic questions and the lively chat. I'm going to wrap up here with one more reminder that we are soliciting manuscripts for conversations about mass violence and environmental degradation pretty broadly. And I encourage anyone who's interested in writing about these issues or speaking to the state of the field to contact myself or Genocide Studies and Prevention. And if you are interested in voicing an idea or maybe doing something non-traditional, please reach out to us because we would like to have a vibrant issue. So with that, I would like to sign off and just thank you all once more.